The year is 1521. The great city of Tenochtitlan, capital of the Aztec Empire, one of the largest and most magnificent cities in the entire world, is falling. And the popular image in your head is probably this: a small band of a few hundred Spanish conquistadors, gleaming in steel armor, mounted on terrifying horses, armed with guns, toppling a mighty empire through sheer courage and superior technology. It is one of the most famous stories in history, and it is almost entirely wrong, because those few hundred Spaniards did not conquer the Aztec Empire alone. Marching alongside them were tens of thousands, ultimately perhaps hundreds of thousands, of indigenous warriors, native peoples, who had their own bitter reasons to want the Aztecs destroyed. The Spanish did not simply conquer the Americas. They exploited wars that were already raging, and the men who would ultimately grow richest from all that conquered wealth were not even Spanish at all. This is the true origin of the Spanish conquest of the Americas, and it is a story of banking, of native armies, of ancient grudges, and of a version of history written by the winners to serve their own interests. And it does not begin in the Americas at all. It begins in Spain, with a war that lasted nearly 800 years. For centuries, much of the Iberian Peninsula, modern Spain and Portugal, had been under Muslim rule. And for generation after generation, Christian kingdoms in the north fought a long, grinding campaign to reconquer that territory, a centuries-long series of wars known as the Reconquista. And this endless war forged a very particular kind of culture. It created a society organized around military conquest, around warriors who expected to be rewarded with land, titles, and plunder for fighting. It produced hardened soldiers, an aggressive religious zeal that fused warfare with the Christian faith, an institutional machinery for conquering territory, subduing populations, and dividing the spoils. In 1492, the very same year that is about to become so famous, the Reconquista finally ended, as the last Muslim kingdom in Spain fell. And suddenly, Spain had a whole class of ambitious, battle-hardened warriors with nothing left to conquer at home, and a deep cultural expectation that conquest was the path to wealth and glory. The conquistadors were not inventing something new when they sailed to the Americas. They were carrying an 800-year-old machine of conquest across the ocean, and in that same year, 1492, that machine found a new direction thanks to money. Everyone knows the story of Christopher Columbus sailing west in 1492. But few people ask the crucial question: who paid for it? Voyages like this were expensive and risky, and Columbus had spent years being rejected. The traditional tale says Queen Isabella financed it, even pawning her jewels. But the reality of the financing is more revealing. A key figure in making the voyage happen was a man named Luis de Santángel, an official and financier at the Spanish court. Santángel helped arrange and secure the funding for Columbus's expedition, using his financial position and connections to put the deal together. And here is the detail that history often glosses over. Santángel was a converso, a person from a Jewish family that had converted to Christianity, a community that faced deep suspicion and persecution in Spain, especially as the Spanish Inquisition intensified in exactly this period. So, from the very beginning, at the moment of that first fateful voyage, we find finance at the center of the story, and we find it tangled up with the complicated realities of money, power, and persecution in Spanish society. The voyage that opened the Americas to Spain was, at its core, a financed venture, a business proposition. And once Columbus returned with news of new lands, the powers of Europe moved with astonishing speed to divide up a world they had barely seen. Within just a couple of years, the Pope, the supreme religious authority of Catholic Europe, issued decrees dividing the newly discovered lands, and this was formalized in the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, an agreement between Spain and Portugal. This treaty drew a line down the globe and splits the entire non-European world between these two kingdoms. Spain would get most of the Americas. Portugal would get Brazil and a route around Africa. Think about the staggering arrogance of that. Two European kingdoms, with the blessing of the Pope, carved up entire continents, home to millions of people and great civilizations, on paper, before a single conquistador had even set foot in most of it. The wealth of the Americas was being claimed and divided as a European asset, before it was even understood, and that reveals the mindset of the whole enterprise. This was not simply exploration. It was the legal and financial parceling out of a world for conquest. And now we come to the heart of the myth, the conquests themselves, and the truth of how those mighty empires actually fell. Start with Hernán Cortés and the Aztec Empire. The legend is of Spanish steel and horses and guns overcoming impossible odds. But here is the reality. The Aztec Empire, properly called the Mexica Empire, was not a beloved unified nation. It was a dominant power that ruled over many other indigenous peoples, often harshly, demanding tribute and taking captives for sacrifice. And many of those subjugated peoples hated the Mexica with a burning passion. When Cortés arrived, he was a shrewd manipulator, and he understood this hatred, and he exploited it brilliantly. Above all, he allied with the Tlaxcalans, a fiercely independent people who were bitter enemies of the Mexica. The Tlaxcalans and other native allies joined the Spanish not out of loyalty to Cortés, but to destroy their own hated oppressors. And they did not join in small numbers. By some estimates, the forces that ultimately marched against Tenochtitlan included on the order of 200,000 indigenous warriors. The few hundred Spaniards were a small component of an enormous native army. The fall of the Aztec Empire was, in large part, an indigenous war, a rebellion of subjugated peoples against a dominant power, with the Spanish as opportunistic partners and beneficiaries. The Spanish did not conquer the Aztecs. They joined and helped tip a massive war that was, in a sense, already waiting to happen. The same pattern repeats with the conquest of the Inca Empire by Francisco Pizarro. Again, the legend is of a tiny band of Spaniards toppling a vast empire. And again, the reality is that the empire was already tearing itself apart from within. Just before Pizarro arrived, the Inca Empire had been convulsed by a devastating civil war, a brutal struggle for the throne between two rival brothers, Huáscar and Atahualpa. This war had split the empire, killed many of its people, and left it fractured, exhausted, and bitterly divided at the very moment the Spanish appeared. Pizarro exploited this chaos ruthlessly, exploiting the divisions and the weakness the civil war had created. And there was another, invisible force at work in both conquests, perhaps the most powerful of all. Disease. The Europeans brought with them diseases like smallpox, to which the indigenous peoples of the Americas had no immunity whatsoever. These diseases swept through native populations with catastrophic effect, killing enormous numbers of people, in some regions, a huge share of the entire population. This biological catastrophe shattered indigenous societies, killed leaders, destroyed armies, and spread despair, often racing ahead of the Spanish themselves. The conquest was made possible not by Spanish heroism, but by native allies, by existing civil wars, and by a wave of disease that devastated the defenders. So the romantic image of the lone conquistador is a fantasy. The real conquest was a story of exploited divisions, native armies, and biological catastrophe. But now comes the final twist, the part that reveals what the whole enterprise was truly about. Because once the empires had fallen, the Spanish found what they had been searching for: unimaginable wealth, and above all, silver. In the Andes, at a mountain called Potosí, in what is now Bolivia, the Spanish discovered one of the richest deposits of silver the world has ever known. Potosí became a mountain of silver, and the Spanish extracted it on a colossal scale, using the brutal forced labor of indigenous people, and later enslaved Africans, under horrific conditions that cost enormous numbers of lives. Over the following centuries, Potosí and the other mines of Spanish America produced a staggering amount of silver, tens of thousands of tons of it, wealth beyond anything Europe had ever seen. And this flood of silver poured across the ocean into Spain, making the Spanish Empire the richest and most powerful state in Europe, or so it appeared. Because here is the final, astonishing truth of the Spanish conquest, the part that the legend of glorious Spanish Empire completely hides. Most of that silver did not stay in Spain. It flowed straight through Spanish hands and into the vaults of foreign bankers. The Spanish crown, despite all its silver, was constantly at war, fighting expensive conflicts across Europe to defend its empire and its Catholic faith. And to fund these endless wars, the Spanish kings borrowed enormous sums from international banking houses, above all the great Genoese bankers of Italy and German banking families. The silver from the Americas was used again and again to repay these loans, or was pledged to the bankers in advance. So the vast wealth ripped from the mountains of the Americas extracted through the suffering and death of countless indigenous laborers, largely ended up enriching not Spain itself, but the foreign financiers who lent Spain the money to fight its wars. The silver passed through Spain like water through a sieve and pooled in the counting houses of Genoa and Germany. And the proof of this is stunning. Despite receiving this river of silver, the Spanish crown went bankrupt again and again. Over roughly a century and a half, the Spanish monarchy defaulted on its debts, declared bankruptcy many times over, by common count more than a dozen times. Think about that. The richest empire in the world, drowning in American silver, repeatedly went broke, while its bankers grew ever richer. Conquest generated fabulous wealth, but that wealth flowed onward past the conquerors into the hands of the financial powers of Europe. The people who profited most from the Spanish conquest, in the end, were not the conquistadors, and not even really the Spanish crown. They were the bankers. And this is why the story matters so much, and why it has been told so wrongly for so long. Because the way we remember the Spanish conquest has been shaped by competing myths, each serving its own purpose. On one side, there is what is sometimes called the Black Legend, a version that paints the Spanish as uniquely, cartoonishly evil, monsters of cruelty and greed. This version was often promoted by Spain's rivals, other European powers who had every reason to blacken Spain's reputation, for their own political and religious ends. On the other side, there is the romanticized conquistador narrative, the heroic tale of brave, noble Spaniards civilizing a savage new world, spreading their faith, achieving glory against impossible odds. This version served Spanish pride and imperial ambition, glorifying the conquest and erasing its horrors. And here is the crucial point. Both of these myths, opposite as they are, distort the same underlying reality for different purposes. The Black Legend makes the Spanish uniquely villainous, ignoring that conquest, cruelty, and empire were features of many peoples and powers, including some of the indigenous empires themselves. The heroic legend makes the conquest a tale of noble European courage, erasing the native armies, the exploited civil wars, the devastating role of disease, and the brutal exploitation that made it all possible. Neither tells the truth. The truth is more complex and more revealing. The Spanish conquest was not the triumph of a few brave men with superior technology. It was the convergence of an 800-year war culture forged in the Reconquista, of international finance that funded and profited from the whole enterprise, of papal authority that divided the world on paper, of massive indigenous civil wars and rebellions that the Spanish exploited, of a biological catastrophe that shattered native societies, and of a global silver economy that enriched the bankers of Europe more than the conquerors themselves. And that leads to the deepest lesson of all. The history we inherit is so often the version written by the winners, shaped to serve their interests, whether to glorify themselves or to demonize their rivals. The real story, the messy, human, morally complicated truth, with its native allies and its foreign bankers and its unglamorous economics, takes far longer to surface because it serves no one's flattering myth. It requires digging past the legends on all sides to find what the evidence actually shows. And when you do, the Spanish conquest turns out to be not a simple tale of heroes or villains, but a story about how conquest, finance, disease, and existing conflicts combined to reshape an entire hemisphere, and about how the wealth of that conquest flowed, in the end, into the hands of those who never lifted a sword, which leaves a genuinely difficult question, and I want to know where you land on it. When you look at the Spanish conquest of the Americas, what do you believe was truly driving it at its deepest level? Was it religion, the crusading zeal to spread the faith? Was it raw greed, the hunger for gold and silver and glory? Or was it, beneath it all, the structural ambitions of European banking and finance, the money that funded the ships and reaped the silver in the end? Tell me in the comments what you think, because historians still argue over this fiercely, and I do not believe there is a simple answer. And if this pulled apart a story you thought you understood, if you want more history where the real cause is hidden beneath the one everyone repeats, then subscribe and stay with us. Because the next story we are opening up is another moment where the world was told one thing, while the truth sat buried in the ledgers the entire time. You will not want to miss it.